Today is September 18th, 2024, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to UC San Diego's Video Legacy Project. My name is Stephen Adler. I am Professor Emeritus of Theater and Provost Emeritus of Earl Warren College at UCSD. In 2021 to 2022, I had the honor of serving as president of the UCSD Emeriti Association, and I'm currently the editor of our quarterly newsletter, Chronicles. The idea of the Video Legacy Project was proposed this fall by the Emeriti Association president, Barbara Parker, and enthusiastically endorsed by the association's executive committee. The aim of the project is to create an archive of interviews with Emeriti faculty and other key players who've left their distinctive marks on UC San Diego. We hope, as the project evolves over the coming years, that this archive will provide a valuable resource to UCSD, to our students, faculty, and staff, both active and retired, as well as family, friends, and the greater community at large. So, today it is my honor and privilege to conduct the very first interview for the project. And my guest today is Dr. Jack Fisher, and I will read Jack's introduction bio in a moment. But Jack, welcome, and I am thrilled to have you here. I'm looking forward to this conversation, and I should also say that I am not a doctor, but I did play one on the stage in graduate school. So I think that will stand me in good stead, but welcome.
You played him well, I'm sure. Happy
Yeah.
to be part of the project. As you will elicit from me, I'm very fond of the Emeriti and its importance on campus, and I'm kind of fond of history as well.
Yes, and I think that's all going to be teased out in our chat, so I look forward to hearing about that. So here's a little bit of biographical information about Jack Fisher. Dr. Fisher is the Edward A. Dixon Emeritus Professor of Surgery and former head of the Division of Plastic Surgery at UC San Diego. He is a native of Buffalo, New York, and completed both his undergraduate studies at the University of Buffalo as well as UB's School of Medicine, from which he graduated in 1962. He received his graduate surgical training at the University of Minnesota, Boston University, and the University of Virginia. He was recruited to UCSD to establish the Division of Plastic Surgery in February of 1975. Dr. Fisher has authored or co-authored more than 200 published works enhancing the fields of transplantation immunity, wound healing, reconstructive surgery, and biomaterials tolerance. In 1977, Dr. Fisher founded Interface, a volunteer team of plastic surgeons, nurses, and other specialists devoted to the care of children born with facial clefts and other deformities. He has performed surgery on hundreds of children in developing nations and received the UCSD Chancellor's Community Service Award. He served for more than a decade on the University of Buffalo's School of Medicine's Dean's Advisory Council. In 2006, he received the UB Distinguished Alumnus Award and delivered the Stockton Kimball Memorial Lecture. He served as president of the UCSD Emeriti Association in 2006-07, as trustee for the American Council on Science and Health, and has many other distinctions and recognitions to his credit. What's notable is that after Dr. Fisher retired, he returned to school and earned an MA in United States Political and Economic History here at UCSD. He is the author of Silicone on Trial, Breast Implants and the Politics of Risk, which deals with the growing conflict between scientific enterprise and America's politically driven regulatory process. His historical works include Lead Pencil Miner, The Rush for Yukon Gold, Stolen Glory, The McKinley Assassination, and Stopping the Road, a campaign against another Trans-Sierra Highway. His most recent published work is Preparing the Soil for UC San Diego, Land, thoroughfares, and local expectations. So, as you can see, Jack Fisher is a polymath of the highest degree and a perfect subject for our inaugural interview for this video legacy project. So, Jack, thank you, and again, welcome. It is great to have you here in the Zoom room. Um, so let's get down to some background information. Um, uh, as you well know, also have a great fondness and connection to Buffalo because, like you, I am an alumnus of the University of Buffalo as an undergraduate. So beef on weck and other culinary delights of Western New York are a shared experience for us. But let's talk a little bit about your own experience growing up in Buffalo and your evolution that you experienced growing up in the city, in the Queen City, the second biggest city in New York State, and then becoming an undergraduate and then a medical student there. You were a child and have memories of World War II in Buffalo. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Amazingly enough, my earliest recollection is Pearl Harbor Sunday, somehow burned into my brainstem. And the image is we're living in North Park, Buffalo, and it's a duplex, so that our close neighbors and my parents are all down on the living room floor over a world atlas trying to figure out where Pearl Harbor was. It's a Sunday afternoon, and the news has finally spread throughout the country. They can find Honolulu, of course, on that particular map, but they can't find Pearl Harbor. So what am I doing? I am, of course, saying, what is a war? What is a war? And I don't remember the specific answer, but I'm sure they tried to explain to me. But as a 4-year-old, I had no concept of what was going on. But I learned because my father, too old to be drafted, shifted work and went to work for a war production company, Bell Aircraft. You probably know where Bell Aircraft was in the area. Very important, the aerospace industry. So he worked for them.
Interesting.
And
What?
was an air raid warden.
That's
And I
great.
went with him on patrols.
Did he have the helmet?
Patrols. No, I didn't have a helmet. They had a special flashlight, though, that you had to aim down because you
Uh,
wouldn't want to point up into the air for the fear that the Luftwaffe would spot you.
right. Um, do you remember, as you got older during the war, do you remember rationing and did you collect tin foil and metal and scrap and do any of that? Did you have a victory garden?
We had a victory garden. Absolutely. Everybody did. The entire backyard was growing vegetables. Rationing. Do I remember rationing? I remember the little red stamps. There were blue stamps. Whenever there were cigarettes available down at the drugstore, I went with my mother in hand, and she handed in her buttons, and I handed in mine so that we could each get our portion of cigarettes or whatever it was. One day there were nylon stockings, if you can imagine that. So I got my pair, her pair. So we were gaming the system, you might say, just a little bit.
Smoking at 7 years old, I love it. Did you have
Walter Raleigh cigarettes she smoked. I even remember.
with the coupons, right?
Yes, exactly. And she saved.
Um, did you have any family or friends who were in service and sent abroad?
Oh, absolutely. The boy next door was a navigator on a B-17, and he did not come home. And I remember the day when Mrs. Davis came over and was crying on my shoulder. It was a very poignant moment because
Oh,
the two service members in uniform had just come to her door.
oh dear. Oh, we see the scenes in the movies, but experiencing it firsthand is very different, of
Yeah.
course.
A boy of 4 to 8 does not play Dungeons and Dragons. He might play with his little Rector set, but we played war. we had our wooden guns and we knew
Mm.
where the enemy was coming from around the garage. I had my own foxhole, etc. The war was a very real experience for everybody. We all clustered around the Philco at 5:30 in the afternoon to hear the day's news, where the troops were, what the head count was, all that sort of thing.
I'd love to hear more stories about this. I'm a particular amateur scholar of World War II. It's one of my great historical passions. So at some point, we'll have to have that offline conversation. Um, did your family, so it was at the time would be considered a middle class family? Did your mother work as well?
Absolutely. My parents were very proud of the fact that they were never out of work during the 1930s. My father worked hardware store, and my mother was the graduate of a business secretarial school. So she, in fact, was an executive secretary for a brokerage firm and can describe the crash of 1929 vividly. But they both worked throughout the 1930s.
Did you have siblings?
Sister had a brother. He passed away from complications of one of the early sulfa drugs. That was a
Um,
tragedy in the family.
how old was he and how old were you at the
Three,
time?
three, 3 years old.
Were you alive? I mean, was he younger
Yes.
than you?
Oh, yes. I was 6. He was
Oh,
3 years younger than I was.
terrible. Sorry. So you were a teenager in the 50s, in Buffalo. Were you going to sock hops and going to drive-in movies and roller skating and engaged in all sorts of high school shenanigans? What was it like being a high school student in Buffalo?
I could never roller skate or ice skate. I had balance issues. I barely learned to ski later in life. No, I was a nerd. I was a nerd. I was a pretty good student right from the get-go. I loved arithmetic. I began to write little stories in English class. Writing has always been fun for me, as evidenced by some of what you've already talked about. But when I hit junior high school and the science courses, that just absolutely turned me on. I love science. When I got to high school, there was biology and biology club. So I was pretty much a nerd. Dating was difficult for me, but I did a little bit of that, and I found somebody to go to the prom with me. But I no sock hops and no driving around to drive-ins.
I grew up in Brooklyn, and believe me, I never went to a sock hop or a drive-in theater either.
Right.
Um, so, what was the first science that you took that excited you? Was it bio, or was it earth science, or chemistry, or what was it?
Biology and earth science. That's yeah, we all took earth science back in those days, and I earth science still sticks with me, by the way. When I go up to the Eastern Sierra, I love geology because and but biology stood out, and I had a wonderful biology teacher. And we did projects, and I did a project, and it went into the Buffalo Evening News science project contest, and I got the runner-up award in that. So figuring out that some kind of medical field was probably my destiny was pretty easy. And of course, my mother was nudging in that direction as well. So,
So, why UB as an undergraduate?
well,
Excuse me, Jack. Let me just add that at the time, University of Buffalo was not part of the State University of New York, which didn't come about until the early 1960s. I think 62 or thereabouts was when.
was transitioning in the final year of medical school for me.
Okay.
So I had 7 years there at a private, what we would today call a private university.
So
Uh,
why UB?
for me to go away would have been even more of a financial stress. And I was a good student, but I don't think that I would have been competitive for the kind of scholarships that would have you, go to a faraway place and there would be the transportation. So, although my mother dreamed of me going to Harvard someday, and of course I had that option years later. We'll get to that. But going to the local university was just, I didn't apply to anywhere else but the University of Buffalo.
Were you pleased with your undergraduate education there?
Oh, yes. And those were the days, when you could get into medical school after 3 years. That's a carryover of wartime. All of medical education was accelerated during the Second World War as well as the Korean War. And I was in classes with veterans of the Korean War. They made it relatively easy. You had to have the grades, but they made it relatively easy then to apply and be admitted to medical school after 3 years of pre-med.
Well, did the MCATs or some similar exam exist at the time?
Nothing like that, no. It was all grades and a personal interview.
I see. What did you major in? Was it biology?
Biology, and my chairman of the biology department was absolutely crestfallen that I was leaving. He said that I would never have a rounded education ever again presented to me. And of course, I've lived with that sentence the rest of my life. And as the facts were that I had some diversity in my courses in the first 3 years. In order to make my major requirements, I would have had to be all biology the fourth year anyway. And in those days, biology was zoology, classifying animals, and botany, huge amount of botany. Cell biology was just coming to the forefront as I hit medical school, so that my courses in medical school were all at the cellular level. Today, they're at the molecular level. So staying a fourth year would have been unnecessary cost, and time is important. So I was happy to move on to medical school after 3 years.
Now, I know that UB's medical school has always been considered a top-notch medical school, especially in New York State. Were there other medical schools on your wish list, or did you just decide to keep going straight ahead with no interference?
Not really. No, I knew about Harvard because well, when you are in Buffalo, I'm jumping ahead to medical school think, but to go on to Harvard from the medical school in Buffalo is considered, the ultimate thing to do. And some have done that. George Thorne, famous professor of medicine in Harvard, was a UB graduate. So there you go. But I didn't do that. No,
Okay.
I was going to go to UB and I could hop the bus and get there easily. That was before I owned a car.
By the time you were in medical school, when you were an undergrad, did you ever live on campus or was it always at home?
Always at home.
I see.
I did not leave home until the day I married my bride.
Tell us about your bride.
Pat was a nurse at Millard Fillmore Hospital. You know where that was. It's been since torn down, interestingly enough, no longer exists. When I was undergrad, I said I was a nerd, but in pre-med days, I did join a fraternity. That was my social outlet. So I won't go into all the details about how easy it is to find nursing students in Buffalo. All of the major hospitals had their own nursing schools. So she was in what was in those days called a diploma school. You spent a year on campus getting some basic courses, but you learned your nursing in the hospital doing nursing. And so we met on a blind date and got married 7 days after I graduated from medical school, and hopped into a Chevrolet pulling a U-Haul trailer and headed to Minneapolis. But I'm sorry, I'm ahead of the story.
That's okay. That's great. Did she continue nursing, by the way, when you were doing your residency?
Absolutely, absolutely. She was a pediatric nurse by preference, She worked ICU at the University of Minnesota hospitals. She always, once a nurse, always a nurse. Pat had an extraordinary nursing career right up until her 10 years before her passing.
Which was when?
2020, sorry, 2020, at age 80, an insulin-dependent diabetic, by the way.
Oh dear.
Took good care of
Um,
herself, though. To live to 80 for a diabetic is pretty good.
um, when you were in med school, I assume that med school training back in the late 50s, early 60s was quite a different kettle of fish than it is today. From my understanding is that it was a lot more coursework, at least because nowadays, from what I understand, most med students start doing rotation work in their third year. But was it that way for you?
It has not changed that much. I know how they've governed the curriculum, but I can just describe most easily that it was 2 years of basic science and 2 years of clinical rotations.
Okay.
The last 2 years, they were called clinical clerkships. And in Buffalo, the class was divided in half, and half the class went to what was in those days the Meyer Memorial County Hospital. Today it's called the Erie County Medical Center. The other half went to the large private hospital, Buffalo General. And then the next year you reversed yourself. So I did my third year in the county hospital, and am always grateful that I did do that, because there's just so much clinical exposure and experience in a public institution. And then I did my final year at Buffalo General. The first 2 years were all basic sciences out at the medical school on the Main Street campus. You know where that is, in a relatively brand new building. It's now an old building, and it's since been replaced by a new medical school. But we were in brand new quarters, excellent quarters, and it was just amazing. And I had a wonderful faculty. A lot of the faculty were trained at Harvard. That's where Buffalo often recruited its faculty. So I have no misgivings or doubts about the quality of the training we received. Now, in the first 2 years, when you are taking mainly basic sciences, they take you off one afternoon a week for introduction to medicine, and you go to a hospital and you begin to learn how to do a medical history, and a physical examination.
I see.
They do that a lot now. Now, I think first year students will begin to have some clinical exposure, but you've got to get through your foundational courses
Right.
to begin with.
So when did surgery and then when did plastic surgery, reconstructive surgery, when did those start to come into focus for you?
Okay, that's two stories. I'll tell them quickly. My very first rotation at Meyer Memorial Hospital was on the surgery service for 12 weeks, and it just totally turned me on. I could identify myself with the surgeon's life, the pace, the kinds of problems, and the faculty impressed me a lot. And I even had the earliest notion that perhaps academic surgery would be appropriate for me. Plastic surgery, not at all. It didn't exist in Buffalo in those days. There was just no exposure to it. So that did not dawn on me until I got to the National Cancer Institute. And you may not want me to tell that story until we get there chronologically.
So, okay. So surgery initially, was it going to be general surgery that intrigued you? Neurosurgery, thoracic? What was,
General, only general. Most of our exposure as medical students was in general surgery, whether you
okay.
were at Meyer or at the Buffalo General. So come my senior year, I am now um, looking at academic surgery training programs. Now, of course, Harvard comes into view. Both their teaching hospitals, the Brigham, it was called then, and the General, and I went and interviewed there. I also interviewed at places in the Midwest and the University of Minnesota, where I ended up going. Harvard turned me down. I rated them number one, but I didn't. There was a matching program by that time.
There was already the
Didn't
match.
match. I didn't match at that time, and Boston, not until later. And so I went to the University of Minnesota.
Well, going from Buffalo to Minneapolis wasn't going to be a wrench in your system because you already had all the long johns and the gloves and the scarves and the boots.
But but it was different. It was different. The Buffalo weather in the winter is constantly changing. And maybe, yes, you'll get a huge snowfall, but you'll also have times when there's very little snow. In Minneapolis, when it gets cold, it stays cold and it gets really cold. And it can be below zero for 19 consecutive days. And it's so cold, you need a head bolt heater for your car and you plug it in so that you can get the car started at the end of the workday. So there were adaptations that needed to be made.
So tell us a bit about was the first year of your residency there more of an internship, rotating through different services again?
Yes, and don't get me going on them taking away the surgical internship. I think that is an error in graduate surgical training, but that's not what this interview is about. Mine was a rotating straight surgical internship. Now, I'll tell you one more thing because I'm kind of proud of this. Early in the fourth year of my medical school, I'm at Buffalo General and I pass in the hall someone I know well, and he ultimately became a professor of medicine. And he chatted with me and he said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "Boy, I think I'm going to do surgery." And he said, "Don't take any surgical electives in your fourth year." The fourth year then was all elective, just like it is now. He said, "Take medical electives." And I did all medical electives, a whole month on cardiology, lots, I won't go into the detail, time on a medical intensive care. That stood me in good stead, and I never regretted doing that. Now I'm in a surgical internship, and it's all surgery, and you rotate on every specialty. And there's advantages to that. You learn little tricks that other surgeons do that can be helpful in your own specialty. I always loved it when I was in an operation and could ask the nurse for the brain spatula. Something I learned in neurosurgery, of course. It's a little instrument. I won't go into detail, but it's good for a gentle retractor. Think of it as a gentle retractor.
I'll have to
Could I have the brain spatula, please?
when we're making dinner tonight, I'll have to ask my wife to pass the brain spatula. That's
It could have adaptations in cooking as well. Absolutely. I'll have to show you one someday.
I look forward to that. So, how long were you in Minneapolis?
1 year for internship, and then I was accepted to stay for the first year of general surgery. Now, I'm still thinking of myself of going into general surgery, but everybody in my group of 12 surgical internships wanted to become a cardiovascular surgeon, except me. Everybody else wanted cardiovascular. I wanted to do something else. So now, for the first time, I'm taking care of the burn patients. I elected to do that. Nobody wanted to go on that rotation. So I said, "Well, I'll go there and I'll do that." I became very involved with burn care. And then we had plastic surgeons from Minneapolis coming in to cover our clinic. And I thought, well, the plastic surgery clinic might be something very interesting. So I did that on a recurring basis. That
And
was the early spark.
okay, so continue with the residency. How did it progress, and did you wind up? How long did you spend in Minneapolis total?
2 years, 2 years,
2 years.
full years. So, I mean, the pace is intensive and you're on call every night, meaning that you work. And when you're on busy services, you're working at night. Um, Fast forward, people were very concerned about exhaustion. You're constantly supervised in a good surgical residency program. You're never doing anything totally independent. There's a gradient of responsibility. There's constant supervision. you can be tired, but it does not affect your judgment. Some people would challenge that, but that's my position. But it was wonderful. I loved it. And my wife was very busy working. She got a promotion after 1 year and was head nurse, got to be head nurse in a metabolic unit, taking care of children with very severe inborn metabolic disorders. So her career was burgeoning as well as mine moving along at its defined pace.
So where did life take you after Minneapolis? What was the
It
next
would
step?
have taken me to Vietnam. Every one of my colleagues in Buffalo that was not as fortunate as I was served time in Vietnam. Remember, those were the days of the Berry Plan, and all doctors did their 2 years of service. I read a bulletin board. Again, it was the bulletin board in the room that the students used in the Buffalo General Hospital. Later on with my children, and I sent them off to college, I said, read bulletin boards. Of course, now bulletin boards are passé. You keep your eyes on the websites, but the bulletin board announced a special program at the National Institutes of Health. They were looking for people to serve in a resident supportive capacity. The deal was if you work as a resident helping to take care of the patients for 1 year, we'll give you a year of research. So I applied for that. I got it. That goes with a commission in the Public Health Service. So it serves as your military time. And I got to work at the National Cancer Institute and do my first year of research.
And that was in Bethesda or DC? Where was this?
Bethesda,
Bethesda.
we hightailed it out of Minneapolis and came down to Bethesda, Maryland, and found an apartment there. And again, Pat immediately got a nursing job. So
What year was this?
that would be 64 through 66.
Okay. And how could you map your evolution career-wise there? How did the path start to become a little bit more defined at that point?
Very defined, and this is the second story that I stalled you on. The mission, the clinical center of the National Cancer Institute is not a comprehensive general hospital. It is a hospital designed to take certain kinds of problems. The surgery branch dealt with pelvic carcinoma, advanced pelvic carcinoma. So we were doing a lot of surgery in the pelvis, things that gynecologists, oncologic gynecologists do today, and head and neck cancer. Two very tough areas. In addition to that, we were consultants to all the rest of the services, any surgical problem that came up on other services. Our surgeons were all general surgeons able to do it. Now, the head and neck cancer stuff, in those days, the style of treatment of cancer was you have to cut out the cancer and you have to have a wide margin around it. Sometimes those principles apply today, but today we have amazing drugs, we have refined radiologic treatments. So this style of surgery is no longer practiced, but the result was deformity. And there was no reconstructive surgery on that service other than periodic consults. So every once in a while we'd have a visitation from a plastic surgeon, either in the Washington area. There was a plastic surgeon from Florida who became a friend and colleague who was doing collaborative research with the Dental Institute. I won't go into detail, but he would come and he would make rounds with us. And then there was a guy named Edgerton from the Johns Hopkins Hospital who I eventually trained with, and he would come. And this was the light bulb in my head. I said, aha, there are surgeons who are concerned about the deformities that result from cancer, trauma, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, that is for me. And that was the beginning of my genuine interest in plastic surgery. And just to fast forward, I applied for the program at Hopkins to train under Dr. Edgerton. I did train under him, but I did it at a different institution because he moved on me. You have to
So
get your good plastic surgery programs, you have to apply and get accepted well in advance.
these are considered fellowships or
Well,
residencies?
nowadays they use the word fellowship more than residency, but residency is sort of a historic term. In the early days of training, the way we do now, which is the beginning of the 20th century, when you were a resident, you lived in the hospital. You were in the hospital all the time. Thus, the term resident. In the UK, residents are called registrars. So
So Hopkins, for how long?
never went there because three
Oh,
months before, after I signed the contract to live in the so-called compound. Do you know anything about
no.
Hopkins and the medical center there? Right across the street from the original classic Hopkins building was a whole city block that was walled off, and it was the compound where all of the residents and their families lived, protected from. Hopkins is not in the greatest section of Baltimore. So we were all scheduled to go there, but then we suddenly learned that my mentor to be had resigned, and we didn't know for 6 weeks where he was going to go. But he found a very, very good position at the University of Virginia, Charlottesville. There was no hesitation in my mind. I wanted him. I didn't want the image of Johns Hopkins, so I followed him to Charlottesville.
And what was the focus of your work with him?
Well, he did it. We trained comprehensively. For instance, it's a 2-year program, and I did 6 months on the hand service, which there was led by an orthopedic hand surgeon. Hand surgery is a area that it became a specialty under the aegis of general surgery, but it's evolved and developed in both plastic and orthopedics. So I was trained in hand. I didn't do a lot of hand surgery. I don't consider myself a hand surgeon. That does require an extra fellowship. Birth defects was a major part of our program there, but burns, I helped develop their burn unit because my interest in burns continued. So I had involvement in a lot of different facets of plastic surgery there, and I stayed on the faculty for 3 years. So that gave me really a 5-year experience there, all under a very, very fine mentor.
Was the idea of combining research and practice something that was immediately attractive to you and a future path in academic medicine? When did that come into focus?
It started the summer breaks in medical school because there were fellowships over summer fellowships. We're not talking about 1 year
Right.
summer fellowships at Roswell Park, Roswell Park Cancer
Sure.
Institute. And I did 2 of those summers where I had one summer I was on the neurosurgery service. The next summer I was on the thoracic surgery service, did little projects in both. So investigation fascinated me just like clinical work did. Then I had the NIH year of research. I knew well enough that if I was going to be competitive for a research university position, I had to have both clinical and research experience.
So when you finished at Virginia, what was the next step?
Um, we've sort of skipped over Boston,
Oh,
and just
okay.
try to be quick about it. When I was done with my service obligation, I had the option to go back to Minnesota. But Boston, of course, always has that appeal for people from Buffalo. What is it? So I applied to Harvard and I applied to Boston University. And with my NIH experience, both institutions were happy to have me come back and train. Believe it or not, the BU offer was better than the Harvard offer. And I went with a bright young surgical team there, and I completed my general surgery at Boston University, and that included 2 more years of research. I had an NIH training grant for 2. So I was in Boston 4 years. So
Okay.
we're 3 years pre-med, 4 years medical school. 2 in Minnesota, 4 in Boston. Now I'm in Charlottesville for
I
2 more.
see.
So when my
You're ready for Social Security at this point after all
yeah,
the.
no, when I finished the residency part of my time in Virginia, my children, I have 3 children who are all watching all of this, and they come to me and they say, Dad, we want you to know that you have just completed the 29th grade. They were counting from first grade.
That's great.
And I said, yes, I've always been slow to learn. Always been slow.
So, wrapping up at Virginia is the real world, as it were, the next step in your career. Um,
Uh, I'm getting job offers now.
okay.
Um, Plastic surgery does not have that many people who combine clinical and research. Universities are looking for such people. You know exactly why UC San Diego would not consider somebody who could not bring some research perspective with them. I have no interest whatsoever in coming to California. California was a place where every 3 years you would come out to the American College of Surgeon meeting in San Francisco. That was California for me. Um, but you see, San Diego changed my mind. I had offers to go to Baltimore. I had offers to go to Boston, back to Boston, but it would have been Tufts. I had a friend of mine from NIH was in the UCLA department. They wanted me to come and look at UCLA. I didn't think that I was ready for LA or that would have been a poor choice, but a year and a half later, I was asked to come out and look at the San Diego job, and I took it. So there you go.
How long had UCSD's medical school been? Was the medical school opened in 60 when the campus, the general campus opened, or did the medical school come a few years later?
Now we're jumping to my understanding of UCSD history that came only after I wrote the little book called Preparing the Soil. So now I'm able to answer that question. The medical school officially started in 64. The university functioned from 1960. So 64 is really the origin year for the medical school. So I came 11 years later, but it's still a very, very young, barely into its adolescence, I used to say. Um, but early days, but it had been around. And of course, we only had the university hospital downtown. We didn't have anything on campus, clinical, nothing, except the VA, of course.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, so when I arrived to join the faculty in 87, so more than a decade after you got here, um, there was still nothing clinical. The only thing on campus were trailers off of Osler Lane with some general family, internal medicine, eye, ophthalmology, and a few other practices located there. And some now academic buildings had opened, but the only hospital was still down in Hillcrest. Um, so who was the mastermind behind bringing you here, and what kind of seductive song was sung to sway you to come here?
Well, Marshall Orloff, the first chairman of surgery, obviously was in charge of the recruitment, but I will give credit to Gene Bernstein, who's now passed tragically from a brain cancer. Gene was my chief resident for the very first rotation I had as an assistant resident in general surgery at Minnesota. And I don't want to brag, but he singled me out in the intern class. He knew when he was going to become chief resident, and he said, will you be one of my assistant residents? The chief residents had the ability to pick people who would help them. And you're the helper bee. You're making life for the chief resident easier because you're working up the patients and getting them ready for surgery and that sort of thing. And then you get into the operating room to assist and that sort of thing. So Gene always remembered me. He was something of a mentor, and he was out here now as a vascular surgeon And he put the bug in Marshall's ear to have me come out and look at the job.
And Marshall Orloff was what was his position?
Emeritus.
Okay. So where did you move to when you and Pat came out here? Where did you live?
Well, we managed to get into La Jolla right away, but not without laying awake nights, saying to ourselves, "What have we done? What have we done?" And realizing that Pat had to find another nursing job. Not that she didn't mind doing that, but we had kids by then, so she had a part-time job just so we could pay for something called a mortgage. You know, that problem that we all have when we move here. We were in a different area than the house I'm sitting in right now. Um, but we were able to make it go. And in the medical school, you start out at a base salary, but anything more than that is dependent on your own growth of clinical practice, which takes a period of time. In plastic surgery, at least 5 years to get a practice going.
So when you joined the faculty here in 75, you had to be you were a pioneer. You were building a division within surgery. You were building plastic surgery. Um, were you also expected to participate in research from the get-go? And what about teaching? What was the mix of, empire building and research and teaching at that and clinical practice in those first years for you here?
So I was on my own for the first 6 months, but I had been granted a VA position so I could recruit help. And the help I found was a man who's still here practicing, Ross Rudolph, and he came from Wisconsin, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and became the chief of the service at the VA. But we traded off. We all had appointments in different areas. I established my interest in facial clefting, cleft lip and palate early on. So that took me to Children's Hospital. People got to know me there. And ultimately, over the span of 20 years, we built up to a group of 6 surgeons. So you're building a faculty. You have to establish a residency training program, and that took 2 years to get enough clinical business to justify the training of a resident. And when we were approved, we just had one resident. But that makes a big difference in the conduct of your. I had an interest in transplantation and immunity, and I was able to raise some funds to bring a full-time immunologist to direct a laboratory. And you'd spend some time in the lab, but when you're building a practice, not enough time to make yourself a true valid scientist. I was a clinical scientist. I worked with people who were scientists, and that is about the best you can do. Looking back on my career, I say I was a teacher and a surgeon who took care of patients. I don't consider myself a laboratory investigator dominantly. But without that research background, I wouldn't have been able to recruit people to come and work in a lab or develop the ideas that lead to the kind of studies that need to be done.
By the way, just throwing a dart in the chronological timeline here, what was the first paper you ever authored or co-authored?
It was a case report when I was at Minnesota. And I'm trying to remember what it was. I think I sent you the CV, and believe it or not, I'm having a senior moment. You would think that you would always remember the first published paper, but at this moment I can't recall. But it's worth saying that that's the thing you start out doing is unusual case reports and getting them published. But you have to move on from there and do things that are more substantive than just a case report.
What was your experience with training doctors here, training plastic surgeons? I know that you have a legacy of having brought in some very good people and developed them. What was how did you develop your eye for talent?
Well, first of all, when you're training with somebody who is a very good teacher, that's important to watch how and when and why. And Milt was a masterful teacher. And you learned by whenever I meet somebody and they somehow learn that I was a professor of surgery, they see me in a lecture hall, standing up and talking about surgery. And I like to sometimes point out, no, you can't teach surgery if you're not also doing surgery. So most of the teaching in surgery is done at the operating room table with the surgeons assisting and constantly in our operating rooms, we talk about what we're doing. There's options, there's choices, there's decisions to be made, because reconstructive surgery is rebuilding, restoring what's normal. People say that it's artistic. No, it isn't artistic. Artists have to be original, but we have an anatomic foundation that we have to work from and work back towards. So I kind of discount the artistic aspect of plastic surgery. We're very anatomic. So a lot of the teaching is in the operating room. It's in the consultation room, talking about to patients about the surgery. Most of plastic surgery, even reconstructive surgery, is elective, meaning the patient is making the decision whether they want to have something done or go on to the next step. A lot of surgery is multiple steps, but each time it's a decision that the patient makes. So that requires a certain style of communication, and residents are learning uh, beside you in that regard. And I picked up from Dr. Edgerton, and I think I followed a lot of his patterns, and I had a pretty good reputation for teaching, and teaching was a high priority for anybody that I recruited to come and work with us.
Um, let's talk a little bit. I'm not shifting gears entirely, I don't think, but I would love to talk a little bit about um, your decision eventually to retire. And you were fairly young as these things go when you decided to retire. What occasioned that?
Well, the University of California, you may well know since you came in 87. Between 1991 and 1994, there were three offers to retire early.
The VERIP plan.
The VEREPs, one, two, and three. And I listened distantly to one and two, but when three came along, I had met the threshold for eligibility for retirement. There's another aspect of the work. We talked about research, teaching, and clinical practice, but there's also administration and
Yes.
dealing with administrators. And I don't want to elaborate about that, but it can wear you down. And I was getting to the point, and I had some personal health issues and all, but the VERIP offer was such that when I presented it to my good friend and attorney and financial advisor, he looked at me and he said, "You would be a fool to turn this down." So that was the spark that led me to officially become, like you now, an annuitant. But I continued to take care of patients. I could stay, there were ways to stay on as part-time, and I could retain my faculty appointment, and I could attend conferences and continue to teach. So it was a natural thing to do.
What year was that, Jack?
94.
94.
Now, I'm only 57 years old, so that's very young, but we're not going to get into too many health issues. But a few years later, I had a heart attack and some bypass surgery. So that's a wake-up call. So I was glad actually when that happened after I'd retired that I was in more control of my life and the time and how I distributed myself. And of course, about that time, I got the notion to engage in a little bit of formal study of history.
Yes, so how did that come about? Because I think that's a fascinating pivot in one's life and one's career, one's own pa finding one's passion anew or refining one's passion at a certain point in life. What was that all about?
Okay, so no, history was not that big a deal in high school. I enjoyed it, but it wasn't a big thing with me. No, I never took a history course at the University of Buffalo. Um, but in San Diego, with clinical responsibilities at the VA, at the University Hospital downtown, at Children's Hospital, I spend a lot of time on the freeway going back and forth. So what do I do? Well, after a while, classical music gets repetitive. After a while, Dr. Laura just does not do it for me, nor does Roger Hedgecock. So I turn to books on tape. There's something about having fiction read to you that did not gel with me, but history was different. So I listened to history books on tape for close to 25 years. Then I met somebody that I bet you know, one of our political science professors, and Professor Popkin. And he knew of my interest in history, but he said, Jack, there's more to history than Stephen Ambrose and David McCullough. So he said, you really ought to do some serious study. So he introduced me to Michael Bernstein, chairman of the department. We chatted a while, and we made a deal for me to be one of their add-on master's students. A lot of people think I did a PhD. I did not. A master's degree was more than enough for me, but I'm so glad I did it. And the discipline of the reading and the argumentation, taking positions, different interpretations, it was just another thrilling experience.
Oh, were you a student at the time that Alex Butterfield was getting his graduate?
Yes, Alex and I became very good friends. Now we should define Alex.
Yes, for the purposes of those who did not experience the Nixon administration and Watergate, would you please tell us a little bit about
There is
Alex
a
Butterfield?
critical moment in the hearings over Watergate when a man who is being interrogated is asked the key question, were tape recordings ever made in the White House? Now, he had already testified before a grand jury, so they knew what the answer was going to be, and the answer was yes. And as they say, the rest is history. Alex was not involved in the criminal activity at all. He was simply a supportive secretary to one of the assistants, but he
Alderman, I think, was it?
managed the traffic in and out of Nixon's office, and
Right.
he turned this machine on every morning, which was set up by the Secret Service. The Secret Service was in charge of. Anyway, the long and short of it was Alex retired back here after becoming the FAA commissioner under Gerald Ford, because he was a former Air Force pilot.
Right.
A wonderful man, and he had an interest in Renaissance history and wanted to do a PhD. But like me, was language lazy. And
Hmm.
that's the reason I did US history, is I didn't want to have to do primary research in a foreign language. So I did US political. He did US history too. But he wanted to get a PhD. Whether he ever completed his PhD or not, I don't know. Because I think he has passed. We've lost Alex.
Oh, I didn't know
Wonderful
that.
man. Wonderful man.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I got to know him.
we were the two old men in the history.
Sure. I, I got to know him a little bit through my colleague Marianne McDonald. They were good pals, and I invited when I was provost at Warren College. My first year was the 2004 presidential election, and I thought, it would be fun to show the students all the president's men and get Alex Butterfield to introduce the film and then talk about it afterwards. So we did. We had an open lecture, and he was terrific.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
What was your thesis?
Well, that explains the book Silicon on Trial. So I'm doing economic history. Why? Well, I was already facile with statistics, so numbers don't overwhelm me. And there's a lot of numbers in economic history. Intellectual history would not have been my cup of tea because I can't keep one philosopher straight from the next. So I did economic history, regulatory history as a part of economic history. So I was going to focus on the FDA, early origins of the FDA. And so I took an argumentative position on a question about early regulatory history and health. Um, the FDA just happened in the 1990s to be going after silicone breast implants. It was an attack on a silicone polymer with no basis in scientific fact whatsoever. Silicone devices are pervasive in medical care. There are no evil diseases caused. I mean, during that scare, people listed 200 different diseases that silicone was supposed to cause. So I took my study of early FDA history, how it gained its power, and then told the story of the breast implant controversy. Thus, the title Silicone on Trial, not just breast implants, but all polymers really were in question. And then the subtitle is Politics of Risk. And risk is politics too. So it's not, there's a political position on every risk question. It's not all science.
Was it
So
fun to write? Did you enjoy the process of writing the
I
thesis?
love writing, but remember that I did other books before then, so it was in sequence. I think we skipped over Lead Pencil Miner is a tribute. Every one of my books is a tribute.
I see.
Lead Pencil Miner, my first history was about my wife's family, who her grandfather went to the Yukon. And Pat and I researched his trip to the Yukon. And so that's a little story about his trip to the Yukon to discover gold. And so Lead Pencil Miner simply meant that he made his money by trading claims rather than digging in the soil. And the nickname for that was Lead Pencil
Oh,
Miner.
okay.
Yeah.
I thought he was making
I
graphite or
wrote
something.
Next, I wrote about the McKinley assassination, which took place in Buffalo, New York, as
Of
you know.
course.
And the medical record is very clear. Anybody trained in modern day surgery will know exactly how and why McKinley died. It was an unrecognized problem at the time, and they didn't have the wherewithal to save his life. A similar injury today in any trauma unit, the patient would survive. So I wrote that story.
Where did the bullet hit him?
Hmm?
Where did the bullet hit him, strike him?
There were two bullets. There was a bad bullet that did not have a full charge gunpowder load, and it bounced off his breastbone. The other bullet went through the stomach and landed inside the pancreas. So he died of traumatic pancreatitis. All the surgeons at the time did was fix the wound in the stomach because they didn't know where the bullet went.
I see.
Next
Um,
was my book about the Eastern Sierra, a tribute to the Eastern Sierra. It's about a highway that was supposed to go across the Sierra. It would have been I-70. It would have been yet another freeway across the Sierra. And it was deterred by a determined group of people in a small community called Mammoth Lakes. And now there is 200 miles of Sierra Nevada uninterrupted by highways, and a John Muir Trail that is uninterrupted by a highway. And the story is an interesting one. And I got it published because people said, well, we don't often have histories of things that didn't happen. Usually we only have histories of things that did happen. So that was kind of fun.
oh, that's
Then
lovely.
Silicon Trial. And then, of course, the Emeriti asked me to be their historian, and I had to find something to do. And that led me to the story of how UCSD got its land.
Which is a fascinating story for me because I have a very much more focused, keyhole focused interest in that based on my research for a book that I wound up not writing, but I did write a couple of articles about it for Emeriti Chronicles about the development of La Jolla Playhouse and the Department of Theater, now Department of Theater and Dance, and how we came to create those theaters and what the land arguments were back and forth. I did a lot of research in the Geisel Special Collection on the evolution of the building of the campus, uh, really starting in the 50s and looking toward the inauguration of the campus in 1960. So I thought that your book was just terrific. It was a
And
wonderful.
therefore, you know step one, and that was Roger Revelle, knowing that if he made a trade of 30 acres, he would get that corner so that the playhouse could go there. And it never went there because
Right.
by that time it was over here.
Right.
And Mr. Genome has that corner now, the Venter Center.
Yes. Well, and one of the reasons apparently that I mean, there were many reasons the theaters never got built there, where the Venter Centers, which, by the soccer fields. Uh, one of the reasons, of course, they could never raise the money to build the theater. But that's another story for another. Maybe we can talk about that offline. So, could you talk a little bit about your involvement in the Emeriti Association? How did you get dragooned into that? And talk a little bit, if you will, about what you accomplished for the Emeriti Association, because you were instrumental in a number of initiatives.
That story begins on the first day that I was a pre-med student at the University of Buffalo, walking onto that Main Street campus. I was just so enthralled by the campus look. I loved university campuses. So I had Buffalo, I had the University of Minnesota campus right out the back of my apartment in Minneapolis. So I've been from one campus to the next, and UCSD fascinated me every time I had to go out to the medical school or a meeting there. And then when the clinical facilities began to be built around the medical school, I was always happy to be out there because, Stephen, I just was curious about what was going on. So now, and I'm meeting faculty all the time. I can't talk too much in detail, but a lot of my patients were university faculty. So I met people in different departments. So now it's 1994, and I discovered that there's an Emeriti Association. I'm still practicing part-time, but I hear that there's a lecture schedule. So I started coming out and just uh, going to the once a month lecture schedules. That was my beginning. I didn't do too much else with the Emeriti, but one day, Bob Hamburger, you remember Bob, professor of pediatrics, good friend, he just tapped me on the shoulder and said, Jack, it's your turn. We need a vice president. And so Bob is very forceful. I didn't really feel like I could say no to him, and I had a little bit more time by then. And Mary Corrigan, a colleague of yours in the Department of Theater, thank goodness, was going to be the president under whom I would study as vice president. So Mary and I kind of formed a little bit of a team. And I didn't even realize that we were going to do something very important, and it was Mary's idea. Do you want me to elaborate on Mary's
Please,
idea?
yes, please.
The Emeriti and no, not the Retirement Association. The Emeriti were administratively under the Academic Senate Office. Now, the Academic Senate Office does some very, very important things. Promotions, appointments of faculty. How important do you think the Emeriti were to them when they're doing all these very, very, very important things? Mary concluded very quickly, we weren't very important at all. We were getting almost no staff support. Meanwhile, over here is a burgeoning retirement association, the largest retirement association in the entire UC system. It's under human resources administratively, and it's led by a magnificent person, Suzanne Cioffi. So to make a long story short, during Mary's year, we were able to conceive of the notion and to make a proposal that the two organizations would work in sympathy with one another under human resources, and Chancellor Fox approved that plan. So there you go.
And when you became president, aside from issuing imperial fiats left and right, what were there any initiatives or developments that you oversaw?
The timing of the proposal to join together was made just at the end of Mary's term. Now I have become the president, and I figure I'm going to be spending the entire year getting this approved because you know how hard you have to fight for space. Chancellor Fox surprised us by approving our plan in 12 days. later on, we kidded her a little bit. We said we were going to propose her for the Guinness Book of Records for making the fastest academic decision in all of the history of higher education. We made her laugh over that. So now I have to figure out what am I going to do significantly. And I have this good friend and colleague of ours, Mel Green, who has the idea of the mentoring program. So I just turned to Mel and I said, Mel, let's run with it. We got to do something. So the mentoring program got its start thanks to Mel's genius and a lot of other input that came together. I mean, we put a lot of heads together to figure out the mentoring program.
And could you sketch that in very briefly, just so people who are
Let's
perhaps
see, now
familiar with?
that's 2006 subtracted from, so we are now 18 years into a program where a bunch of gray-haired professors mentor undergraduate students from the first day they step on campus, relatively unique in the university world, although there are some other universities that do it. Famously, North Carolina State did it, and that's where
Mary Ann
Chancellor
Fox
Cox
Stanford.
came to us from.
Right.
So she was very much in sync with the idea, and in fact, pushed us a little bit to really get it going. That was good timing. It's worked out amazingly well. You are a mentor. I am a mentor. I've mentored, I think, close to 50 students over those years. I usually mentor pre-meds. The first thing you have to do is get the gray hair out of it. They think they're being judged by their mentor. Why wouldn't they be? So they're on their guard. And you have to say, listen, we are your champion. We're on your side. We do not grade you. We don't talk to your parents. We don't talk to your faculty. In 24 years, I have only talked to one set of parents, and that was over an unfortunate situation I don't want to elaborate on. He came out of it very well.
So, um, what if some of your mentees gone on to do? Have you had mentees who are now practicing physicians and surgeons?
I am in touch, I think, still with almost 25 of what I'm going to estimate is almost 50 mentees. They weren't all going into medicine, but many of them were into science fields too. One of them was a political science major that was early in the program when we didn't have all of the fields covered. And he went on to work in the State Department. I haven't heard from him for a while. The one I'm following most closely is now a medical resident at the I should give it the new name. I think of it as the Peter Bent Brigham Hospital for when I was in Boston. It's the Brigham and Women's Hospital, one of the two major teaching hospitals of Harvard. He's an internal medicine resident there now, and I think might well come back and practice here in San Diego. He's from that community of emigres that live out in El Cajon, work day and night to put their kids through college, and he has done so well. Abdikarian, one of our star mentees, and has had a spectacular career. So it's fun to follow those people as they move through their steps, of course. Same for you with the theater students.
So, as we wrap up today's wonderful chat, what have you been doing for pleasure and fun? I mean, obviously, the pandemic put the brakes on everybody's plans for a bit, but what have you been up to that's been giving you joy, and what are you looking forward to?
Well, having lost my wife back in 2020, just before the pandemic got underway, that did change things significantly. But I've teamed up with an old friend who lost her husband about the same time suddenly to a heart attack. So Alice and I have been traveling. We had never cruised before, so we've gone on cruises. We've gone on road trips. We visit family back east. She has family back east, so do I. We're about to embark again. I still read a lot of history, and I'm working on another book this one a little bit closer to my field. It's how the development of a simple procedure called grafting skin, which begins back in the 1600s, eventually gave us all of the scientific awareness that allows for organ transplantation today. So that's the current writing project and requires a little bit of reading. And of course, the wonderful thing about being a graduate student in history is you learn how to use a library well, and you learn how to use a digital library as well. So nothing is more fun than either going up to Geisel or going online to our wonderful Geisel library.
For those who don't know it, it's right behind my head.
It is
Um,
indeed. And
well,
in preparing the soil, there are four notable pictures of how that building got built. A story unto itself.
get that book, Preparing the Soil. It's a wonderful history of how UCSD
And
came
it's
about.
online. It's online too,
Oh,
you know.
is it now online? That's
It's in
great.
the digital archive. If you go on UCSD and just say preparing the soil, or you go on the Emeriti Association website, it'll lead you to it.
That's great. Good to know. Well, Jack, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure for me to learn more about your background and your development as as a physician, a surgeon, a scholar, and a mentor, and a major part of UCSD's legacy. And I'm very grateful that you took the time to do this. I wish you and Alice a lovely time on your upcoming Canadian Maritime and French Quebec trip that you'll be embarking on in a couple of days.
Well,
And
thank you, Stephen. And we left something out very important.
yes,
Arthur Wagner and I came here at about the same time, and I became a friend of UCSD Theater. And the evolution of the Department of Theater is that's amazing story that a book ought to be written about. So I hope you have somebody from the theater department on, or that you get to be interviewed yourself.
we'll see as we move down the line. Jack, again, thank you very much. It really is a great treat, and we're very grateful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Stephen.